Hello, people. This is Quantum Egg, and today we're going to be talking about Dune.
You know that quote from Charlie in the Chocolate Factory when he's like, "Hello, Starshine, the Earth says hello." That's what you just did.
I hope I'm not as creepy as Willy Wonka.
Always.
Especially, well, I don't know.
There's a link there.
Oh,
Willy Wonka.
there is.
What do you mean?
Timothy Chalamet.
Oh,
Willy
yeah.
Wonka.
Who is such a, like, he's not got the creep factor in the film at all.
But we're not talking about that. We're talking about
Dune.
Fantastic.
Right, so we recently went to see the film, the second, is it part two?
Part two.
Part two of Dune. So I have a question for you guys, first and foremost. What is your relationship with Dune? Have you read the books? When did you read the books? If you have, any strong feelings about the subject material?
My first encounter with Dune was my parents showing me the David Lynch film when I was a kid.
Oh, right.
Horrific. Horrific for a kid. It scared me senseless. It wasn't great, should we say that? It had its charm. Loved the practical effects.
Yeah.
That was lovely. But it was I mean it's heavily criticised and laughed at these days. But it has its charm.
Is it worth watching?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think if you like films and like you want to, I don't know, kind of watch something not just for enjoyment, but
To have a laugh.
to have a laugh. But it disturbed me a lot. And then I read the first book ages ago. Didn't really go back to it. Didn't even know there was 6 books. I had no idea. I knew there was a second and third one. I read like half of the second one, and then I read the third one.
Okay. I think most people know there's a trilogy.
Yeah.
But I do think most people are surprised when they find out there's like
6
books.
Yes.
I was surprised when you told me that.
It's a lot.
Yeah.
It's a lot.
Oh, so you've had like quite a long relationship with Dune
I have.
then.
But it's always lived in my subconscious. It wasn't until I think the announcement of the first film with Timothy Chalamet was like it came back into my consciousness. I was like, oh yeah, I like that.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
and I want to go more into that.
We do apologise. The dog is chewing a bone very loudly.
It was either that or he just barked through the whole thing. So we had to throw him a bone, literally.
Throw him a bone.
Okay, so Bo, what's your relationship with Dune?
Well, I became aware of it. Okay, I'm actually going to say this. It's kind of cringe. I used to watch a lot of PewDiePie, and PewDiePie had a book club.
I did not expect that!
He had a book club where he would review like different books to get
Okay.
his audience reading, because you know they all played a lot of video games, and he likes manga and stuff. And he was like,
It's a man who reads.
it's a man who reads. So he read Dune.
Or did he read Mein Kampf?
I wouldn't be surprised.
Sorry. Carry on.
So yeah, I remember him saying that it was like very strange, and I remember just the plot and being like, that sounds interesting, but also like a bit of a slog. So I put it off, like reading it for a while, especially because I've only just really had the confidence to go after a hard sci-fi.
Yeah.
And then I decided, because I've been listening to a lot of audiobooks, and I like stuff that kind of I can just kind of have on in my ears, to kind of suck me into a world. So yeah, I decided to start listening to some more longer books.
So you listened to the first one?
Yeah, I didn't get through it to the end the first time, but on my second go, I got to the end.
Okay, so you've read the first book.
Yes.
Seb, how many books have you read?
Like 2.5.
Why 2.5?
Because I didn't finish the second one.
Was that by choice?
I got bored, and then I looked up what happened in the rest of it.
Fair enough.
That is one thing to say
I
about
couldn't be
Dune, is
bothered.
it is quite boring.
Depends.
Like, it picks up in places, and it's definitely like a slow mover on purpose. It
Yeah.
builds a lot of tension quite well, but it is also extremely slow.
Okay. Well, I should say I haven't read Dune. I've seen both of the films, obviously, and I've done a lot of research for this episode, but I haven't read them. So anytime you guys want to like throw in a bit of a tidbit about the books, please feel free to do so.
Will do.
Before we move on, I just wanted to talk about hard sci-fi a little bit more. You sort of brought that up, Bo. And I was just, because I think Dune's reputation is it's a long, hard sci-fi with a lot of politics, and it's quite dry, and there's not a lot of characterization, as a lot of 50s and 60s sci-fi was like that.
Yeah.
Would you say, compared to those books though, Seb, because Seb is our resident sci-fi expert, would you say compared to other books of its era, it did anything different though?
Yes. I think compared to the books of its era, to me, it's not hard sci-fi.
Interesting, okay.
Like, you know, the hard sci-fi was so cerebral that sometimes it didn't even have a clear setting. You know, Arrakis is the planet. You're aware that they're in space. There's a very set system. It's not... It has cerebral elements, but they're very grounded in the reality of the book and the cultures kind of presented. They're not, you know... They're never there to be like, oh my God, what's happening? Who is this person? Is this person even real?
Yeah.
We don't know. It's very grounded.
Okay.
And it to me, it's more of a political drama than anything.
Okay.
It's political drama through the lens of sci-fi.
Would you say in that case then, it has more in common with the likes of, we'll say, Game of Thrones,
Yeah.
for the sake of, that's quite a popular story that most people know,
Yeah.
as opposed to... Do androids dream of sleep?
Yes. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Because
Do androids dream of sleep?
I knew what you were saying.
I know what you mean. Yeah.
What's the title?
Do androids dream of electric sheep?
Yes, that's the one.
Oh my god!
Do androids dream of sleep? I know what you mean, though. I know what you mean. Yeah, it's a lot more, it's a bit more Game of Thronesy, really. And I think some people would say, well, you can't compare the two. And, like, yes, in terms of setting and era and, you know, fantastical elements and all of that. But, you know, with the family trees, the way the politics are structured, everything like that, there's such a human element to it with that.
Definitely. Actually, on the subject of Game of Thrones, Bo actually sent me an interesting TikTok the other day, which was Brandon Sanderson being asked if he would finish the Game of Thrones series if J.R.R. Martin didn't.
Yeah.
Like, if he passed away before he did it, which, honestly, a bit of a shady ask, to be honest.
Isn't it? Poor George, he's not going
No one
anywhere.
can stop talking about how George is going to die.
I know, let the man live.
Really?
Yeah.
But besides the point, but Brandon Sanderson was talking about how he wouldn't for a number of reasons, but mainly because of how he views magic. And he views magic as almost being very sciencey and being about forward thinking and progress.
Right.
Whereas he's talked to George about it, and George likes it to be slightly more arcane and dark and like unknowable. And I think that's definitely true for Dune as well.
I disagree only with the context I know.
Okay.
And that is the fact that before the events of Dune and, you know, the whole Butlerian jihad and all that, the reason they actually managed to get any sort of, you know, I guess magical powers is because all AI machines were banned.
Yes,
It
yeah,
was
I
all
did know
banned,
this.
and then they kind of just bred this thing. So it came for a purpose. It was like scientifically made, if that makes sense, and like put into people and
What, the power?
yeah, so that they could compute like the power of the mentats. That's not magic as much as it is just they've got to this point of like being able to calculate so fast that it's like.
But wouldn't you say that it's basically magic at that point though?
It is, but I don't think it's like arcane.
I don't know, the way that the Bene Gesserit is depicted.
The way it's depicted, definitely in the films, yes.
Yeah.
But I think the intention was to make it like, it's hard to explain. So it's like grounded in something, but through the eyes of the people of Arrakis and the Fremen, it's arcane.
Okay.
Like they wanted it to gain that archaicness and that, you know, that mysticism. They
Right,
wanted it to
okay.
come across that way, when actuality, it's something it's a skill. It's not, you know, it's not inherent to the person. You have to be trained. You know, it comes from a long line of breeding and genetic, you know, messing around and stuff.
That's true, but I would argue that's basically magic users as well.
I mean, I guess.
Not to get like, sorry, we're getting a bit off topic, but
I'm
just
enjoying it. Carry on.
but just in terms of a lot of fantasy, people who have powers, it's because of certain bloodlines.
Yes, but I think with the context of it, I see what you're saying, and I do agree to an extent.
Yeah.
I just think with the context of this, to me, it's like way less arcane.
Okay.
And more like, well, it's come from somewhere. Mm-hmm. Whereas I feel like a lot of the time in fantasy and magic systems, it's like, ooh, you know, it's kind of in the air, in the earth, and, you know, bread or whatever, and it's not.
Yeah, I think it can be. I do think there are certain like fantasy stories where it is sort of cultivated in the same way, though.
Certain, but I
Yeah.
don't come across it often.
Fair enough. Fair
Like,
enough.
To be honest, like, and when I'm comparing it to Dune, to me, it's very, very different.
Okay. Yeah, I can see that.
Mm-hmm.
So, sorry, tangent, but what did you guys think of the film? Did you like it?
Yeah,
Yeah, I like
you go. You've not spoken in a while.
Yeah, no, I really like the film. I loved the first one as well. It's also not the kind of film that I usually like. We had this joke that I can't sit through a slow movie, though, that I get bored.
I don't consider Dune a slow movie.
Really?
No.
I think it's slow. I think it's objectively slow.
I think it's long. I don't think it's slow.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, all right.
When you think of the amount of action sequences that are in Dune,
It's
The
a lot.
first one.
a lot.
A lot. I rewatched it about a week and a half ago. It's so actiony.
I think it's a kind of vibe, though, isn't it? It's a kind of the tension of it. Like, it's a very tense, kind of meandering, kind of slow. It feels very much like you're kind of in a desert trudging along. Like,
In
that's
places.
the kind of. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm just saying
Yeah.
that's what I got from it. I wouldn't say it. I would say that I thoroughly enjoyed it. It was great. The visuals were stunning. The acting was really good. Oscar Isaac was great. Very
Oh,
slay.
he's so good. He encapsulates that character so well.
And who played his mum? What's her
Oh,
name?
Rebecca Ferguson.
Oh,
Yeah.
She's
love her.
stunning. She's
Incredible.
amazing.
I've loved her since she was in The White Princess or White
Yeah,
Queen.
The
or
White
whatever.
Queen, yeah.
It's so good.
Yeah.
So good.
Yeah. Zendaya was really good as well. Thought she
Yes.
did a very good job.
And so was Timothy.
Yeah,
Yeah,
he was
Did a good
great.
job.
He was a very good.
I don't know why I'm
Timothy.
saying that. Like, I'm surprised. He's a good actor.
He gets a lot of hate though. A lot
Yeah.
of people think, oh, he can't do that. You know, they don't take him seriously, or you know, and it's like,
I think it was the best decision to cast like a twink for the role. Honestly.
yeah, yeah.
Well, it's accurate. It's
Yeah.
both accurate because, you know, he starts out a teenager, doesn't he? So
But also just that, like, he's got that pretty boy privilege, you know?
well, exactly.
And he's the mouse, he's the Muad'Dib, isn't he?
Yes.
He moves quickly and silently. So,
Yeah,
really good
Muad'Dib.
casting.
And it's
really.
good. I also enjoyed the film. I think I got a very different reading of it to you, Bo. But I think that's just the nature of films. Yes. Okay, right. We're going to move on to section 1 now, which is the main meat of our podcast episode today,
Yes.
because we're going to ask the question, what is a white saviour narrative?
Ooh.
So I've got quite a long quote here, but bear with because I think it's important we get this right. So, the term white saviour was derived from a phrase coined by Nigerian-American writer T.J. Cole, the white, quote, the white saviour industrial complex, end quote. In 2012, a non-profit organisation, Invisible Children, raised funds to support those victimised in Central Africa by the militia leader Joseph Kony. However, public opinion on the organisation quickly soured when it was learned most of the donations were not being used to directly help those affected.
Is that what that was?
Yeah.
The Coney thing.
Yeah.
Oh wow. Okay. Sorry. Carry on.
So, in response, Cole tweeted, quote, the white saviour supports brutal policies in the morning, founds charities in the afternoon, and receives awards in the evening, quote. Which is, that's cold, man.
Yeah.
It's ice cold. It's so
brilliant.
good. So when we're talking about in terms of narratives, the white saviour is often used to refer to a white person uplifting, improving, or saving brown and black people, who were often depicted as helpless, primitive, or barbaric. And
it's like people on their gap year going to countries and like building wells and building, you know, things for the poor, helpless indigenous people.
And taking selfies.
And getting a little hero complex out of it.
100%.
Yeah.
So in grander, more politically driven narratives, such as Lawrence of Arabia or The Last Samurai, the white saviour is usually a man, which I think is quite interesting, because the white saviour only tends to be a woman when the stories are more domestically centred.
Yeah.
So films like The Help or The Blind Side, and it's usually people within her immediate circle,
Yes.
as opposed to these grander storylines.
Yeah.
So when we come to Dune, it's a story which is actively and purposely engaging with the problem of a messianic white saviour imposing himself on another culture. How do we know this? Because Frank Herbert told us.
Yeah.
So in 1969, in an interview with Willis E. McNally, Frank Herbert discussed at length about wanting to explore the myth-making process of creating a messiah figure through the character of Paul Atreides. And he also talks about wanting to explore what he calls the Western fallacy. He describes this as the process of the West imposing itself on other cultures and landscapes through means of force,
You can say it. I believe in you.
mathematical calculation and technology. So in this case, I think a lot at the minute there's been a sort of clickbaity culture around Dune of, is it a white saviour narrative? I don't think that's a useful question.
No. Well, he knew it was. He's literally talked... That was the intention in a way.
Yeah, exactly. So the better question is, how successful is Dune in deconstructing its themes of white saviorism, and does it, in doing so, fall into some of the pitfalls of the genre? Simple enough. We love a straightforward, easy question at Quantum Egg. So yeah, I want to talk about the film at first, because obviously the film and the book are using two different languages to describe this theme, and I want to talk about how successful you think it was at portraying this. So in the next section, I want to talk about the film as opposed to the books, because film and books have very different languages in how they convey things. So how well do you think that the director, and Seb is going to say his name because I can't speak French.
Denis Villeneuve.
Thank you. How well do you think he conveyed what Frank Herbert was clearly intending to be the message of Dune?
And we're not allowed to compare it to the book.
No.
Oh, okay.
Well, you can, but in terms of... I also want you to think about it as an isolated piece of media.
Right.
Because most people, when they experience Dune, will just watch the film.
Yeah. I don't think it's... How do I put this? The idea of the white saviour thing in it, I don't think is anywhere near as touched on as it could be.
Oh, in the film?
In the film.
Okay.
In its self-awareness of that. I think it's more concerned with aesthetics and soundtrack and visual appetite and, you know, making a grand blast, wow, look at what we can do.
Yeah.
And yeah, I just think it's way more concerned with those things than it is about, I think, the cultural issue. It's you know, there's a lot of talk about, oh, the Fremen people should be freed. They're very obviously a massive metaphor for cultures we have in our own world and, you know, the way humans in the West interact with them. But it's not... It kind of scratches the surface. I don't think it goes much deeper than that.
Yeah.
Well, let me ask you a question then, because you're saying that it focused much more on aesthetics. So, putting aside the books for a moment, let's talk about the aesthetics.
Okay.
And what that sort of visual language, what it's trying to signal to the audience. What did you... just put your head in the mind of how you were when you viewed it. Let's take off our critic hats for a moment. And just, what did you think and feel about the way everything looked in Dune when you saw it?
I think, like, so I'm coming into this first time. I think what I would think about when I watched it was, first of all, we're introduced to like the splendor of the way that House Atreides lives. Timothy is obviously a very good-looking boy, despite all of the, you know, inbreeding and whatever that eugenics would, you know.
I thought you were talking about Timothy Chalamet then, like...
No!
Also, they're not inbred.
No. I was making a bad joke. I do apologise. I'm just saying, I was making a joke because a lot of the times, I was thinking about the Targaryens and how they're often like, you know, inbred, but also really pretty.
You're talking about they're a specific class of people.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the stereotypes that come with that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, there's that. And, you know, I'm thinking about the way that House Atreides are introduced and the way that the Fremen are introduced.
Okay.
And the way that the Fremen are introduced in the movie is obviously people lining up, kind of praying. They're wearing kind of desert clothes. Zendaya's going, oh, you know, in the background with exotic music.
Yeah.
She barely even shows up in the first one, except to kind of make sexy faces at the camera.
It is, like, interesting that the Fremen are introduced praying and, you know, sort of being inherently tied to mysticism, as opposed to House Atreides being tied to technology and grandeur and power.
Yeah, and it's also about the fact that it's kind of obviously all told from Paul's perspective as well. Like, that's who we see. And I think the film is trying to make you feel that kind of sense of like grandeur and being overwhelmed with the splendor of the outfits and everything else, which it does very well. But I don't think it does the same for the Fremen, really.
No, not at all. I think they're deliberately the other way, aren't they? Kind of represented as, it's like you say, it's like, you know, the sort of poor black and brown people who need to be freed. And who do they turn to for that? Well, their messiah, you know, the Muad'Dib, you know, what else is he called in it? I can't remember. Muad'Dib.
Lisan al-Gaib.
Lisan al-Gaib, that's it. That's the... Yeah, to the
that's to the Bene Gesserit.
Yeah.
Well, I just want to say on the subject of the appearance of the Fremen, so there are two things I want to talk about here. First is, Seb, please name the director.
Oh, Denis Villeneuve.
Villeneuve was interviewed by the Nerds of Colour, which is their website, about his choice of casting. And this is what he said in response to the casting of the Fremen. Quote, I tried to be... Actually, do you know what? I've done a lot of quoting. One of you two can read.
Go on then. Quote, I tried to be as faithful as possible to the images I had in my mind when I read the book when I was young. And this idea that the world of the Fremen would be kind of inspired by culture from North Africa and the Middle East, culture that I deeply love, by the way, because it's a very complex world. There was this idea that there was something powerful that will come out of Africa in Frank Herbert's mind. End quote.
So I think it's interesting here that there's no specific culture that the Fremen are based on.
Yeah.
Which is intentional because Frank Herbert didn't... It was a hodgepodge of Middle Eastern, African sort of like cultural practices.
Yeah.
And then in terms of religious practices, he included a lot in what the Fremen were going for.
Yeah.
However, visually, I do think something is a bit lost when it's so universally just not white.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Especially because, and I talked about this with you guys when we came out of the film, but there was one shot in the new film that really struck me, which is when Paul and his mother, Jessica, come back to the hideout of the Fremen, I want to say, or their city.
Yeah, is it the main siege?
Yeah, that's
it.
Sieges. But there's all of these black and brown men and women who are wearing ethnically diverse clothing, but roughly Middle Eastern clothing, start wailing and sort of like create this mob sort of vibe.
Yeah.
There's a mob vibe.
Yeah.
Around Paul and Jessica. And because of that, no. They create a mob around Paul and Jessica, and that made me realise that all of the main cast are all light-skinned or white. So they're light-skinned brown people or white. You don't have any dark black people at all.
Mm-hmm.
And visually, I think that's a little bit dodgy.
Yes. I completely see that. And it's something that I think most audiences wouldn't think about, but purely for the reason that they're so used to that.
Yes.
And it's so starkly contrast, and we've seen it so many times, that it becomes like, oh yeah, well of course you'd do it that way. And it's not questioned, and maybe it should be.
I think it should be, especially, Bo, I'm going to get you to read a quote now by Alec Cardew-Ravery. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. But it's from his article, Is Dune a White Saviour Narrative?
Quote, what remains on the sandy plains of Arrakis is, in large part, a vague Middle Eastern and North African aesthetic, peppered with actual Arabic words and filmed on location in Jordan and Abu Dhabi. Unfortunately, that aesthetic is not neutral in Hollywood, and the image of an Arab-ish crowd or veiled wailing women, not to mention when it's injected with violence, has a history that is steeped in the dehumanization of entire peoples. I think that's... Sorry, end quote. I think that's really interesting, because actually I was going to ask you guys a question about how you felt about the word jihad being used. Like... because it's got such a loaded connotation.
They don't actually use it a lot in the film.
No,
not in the film. Okay, I'll save that for a book discussion.
They made the active decision not to use it, and they instead call it a crusade.
Yeah,
that's a good choice.
Yeah.
Is it?
I think nowadays, like,
because the word jihad has been entirely misconstrued and twisted by the media, and it doesn't mean what you think it means.
Well, that's what I'm saying, though.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. People have this idea about what that word means.
But why should we adhere to the idea rather than what it actually is? Is it not more important to represent something authentically than go off the idea, oh, that's too biased now in the media? You know, I see what you're saying.
Tackle it with care, but still try, is what you're saying.
Perhaps, yeah.
I think it comes down to accuracy versus sensitivity for a specific time period.
Yeah.
And I think there's an argument to be made for both.
I agree, yeah.
But seeing as with how the crowd was depicted in this film, I think that wasn't very sensitively handled.
No.
So why are we not sensitive about images, but we are sensitive about words? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
That was nice. Well done.
Thank you.
So true, though, because, yeah, I mean, they're perfectly happy to depict something as stereotypical as, like, oh, look at the, you know, Arab-ish crowd, the very kind of neutrally Middle Eastern / African meld of people versus, you know, this very obviously Western group.
Yeah, and I should interject here and say that these are the opinions and reactions of two white people. Myself and Bo are both white, and Seb, you're mixed race, half Turkish, half white.
Yeah, yeah.
So I just want to point that out, because obviously we all have our own biases. Do you know what I mean? And I suppose to you, Seb, like, images of that are not necessarily just associated with, you know, the way that we'd associate them with them, which is that Hollywood kind of,
yes,
oh, that's a people from over there, who are strange and wear funny clothes.
Like, that could be my nan, that could be my dad.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like, he would have been so good in that as an extra, just saying. He would have been very awkward.
I could really see him as Stilgar.
Oh, 100%. He'd be brilliant. Are you joking? No, it's true though, and, like, you know, unfortunately, thankfully, you know, it's not really happened to me because I'm incredibly white passing, and, you know, I got a lot of my mum's genes, whereas my brother and my dad have had a lot of racial abuse and a lot of, you know, in school, my brother got called a towelhead all the time.
Oh God,
awful.
I know, Merlin, isn't it awful?
Horrible, isn't it,
racism is so horrible.
Yeah, where's the bone? Here. Merlin, what's this? Yeah, and, you know, my dad has been yelled at by teenagers on the train, calling him a terrorist and stuff, and that's kind of was just their everyday reality, and it is loaded, and it is important, and it is something that plays on my mind when I see these stereotypes and, you know, this kind of religious fanaticism and the way they're all clothed and stuff. Whereas, you know, I mean, anyone with any sort of worldly awareness whatsoever knows that that's not really the reality for most people who live in those regions.
I think personally that's why those images disturbed me so much, because I think it's so ingrained.
Yes.
Because I don't want to be like, oh, I was immediately woke when I saw that. I wasn't. I just watched it and was like, you know, cool looking thing. This is a bit disturbing.
Yeah.
This is tense. And then I double checked myself, and I was thinking about. Do you know that scene in what's the film called where it's the guy with the whip?
Indiana Jones.
Indiana Jones.
Yeah.
Were you thinking of a different?
No. Worry. I don't know why, but my mind went to the Hunger Games.
Okay, no, it's Indiana Jones, but do you remember I don't know what film it's in, but he's in a sort of Arab place.
Yes.
And there's that whole bit where this guy does like some like sword acrobatics, like, and then he just shoots him.
Yeah.
I always thought that was so funny.
Do you know, but it is funny.
Yeah.
But then you think about it and you're like, so you're trying to say that one country is less advanced than another.
Oh,
Yeah.
100%.
And one country is stupider.
Look at them with all their crazy rituals and their strange, funny ways and their, you know...
But we're American and we have guns.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, literally in Dune Part 2, you know, suddenly... Oh, remember all those warheads we had stored here? Let's go have a look at those, Paul. And it's like, wow, could you be more America if you tried? And I'm not saying that as like... necessarily it's a bad thing, but
well, this is the thing. I don't think the inclusion of any of this by Frank Herbert was meant to be taken as a positive. I just think the language of the film doesn't do enough to combat the stereotypes.
Exactly, it doesn't at all, and it forgives it, and it wants you to root for Paul, and it wants you to, you know, kind of have that, you know, you are kind of rooting for him and the Fremen and everything. You're like, yeah, lead these people into freedom, man. And then the whole time, you know, he's like, oh, but if I do this, it's going to start a holy war that will kill billions and billions of people. But he does it. He does it anyway.
Funnily,
and it's
Seb,
epic.
Funnily, Seb, that's our next section.
Wow.
What a great
Look at that.
In this section, good discussion, by the way, guys.
Yeah.
I think that was very nice. I don't know why I felt the need to say that.
It's nice to be appreciated.
Appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
Thanks, guys.
But the next section, we're going to talk about Frank Herbert, so feel free to go sick with the books. And we're going to talk about his take on fascination with religion. So I'm going to ask you a question now, guys, as someone who hasn't read the books. We touched on it a little bit, but how do you think the book engages with race, and how is it different to the films?
Ooh, I don't know if I missed this, but I feel like it hardly does.
Okay.
Like, I don't remember it being something that was at the forefront of my mind as I was listening to it.
What was at the forefront of your mind then?
I think the whole, like... I think because no one's... Oh, this is the thing. I'm trying to see if I didn't remember it because I just wasn't listening that closely. But I think that I was very much thinking about, like, the desert and the Middle East. Like, with, you know, because it's obviously supposed to be a parallel. But there were no specifics in terms of, like, who's what race or anything like that.
So it didn't activate in your brain sort of any engagement with race or...
Well, I definitely imagined the Fremen as, like, brown because they're from the desert.
Yeah.
And because of the way they act and the way they talk and the way they dress and everything else. But, so that's...
That's so interesting.
Really?
Yeah, because... I didn't when I first read it, and I was probably partially influenced by the miniseries and the film, and I can't remember which is which, but like there's a lot of white people, like a lot of the Fremen are played by white people, and whether that's right or not, I don't know. It's not really, you know, part of it, but they are definitely coded that way, but it's not really a focus at all.
Yeah.
It's not race in terms of their skin colour or the way they aesthetically look. It's about their identity and their cultural identity. And the way that they live their lives and who they are and how they've been oppressed. It's not about...
So let me ask you this question then. Because obviously we come to Dune from our specific time and place in history and our specific politics. So do you think identification with the Fremen could change depending on what sort of place you're coming from reading it?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. I think, it's kind of tempting in your mind to be like, well, they would be, looking this way and that way because they live in the desert. And as the world as we know it, that's that largely in African countries and Middle Eastern countries, but there's also plenty of desert in America.
Yeah.
And, California is massive desert, and the South.
And the Mongolian desert as well.
And the Mongolian desert.
Which, funnily enough, the Mongolian folklore is where you get the giant worms from.
Well, yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
So I think they could 100% be different and definitely change. And it depends where you are in the world. It depends in what time you're coming at it from. I think the story of the oppressed and the oppressor is age old. That could apply to so many different circumstances. And of course, people are now drawing parallels due to, in our political situation, because that's what we see now. But at the time that Frank Herbert was writing, that wasn't nearly as prevalent.
So do you see the sort of nebulous nature of the Fremen's racial identity?
Yeah.
Understanding, of course, that race is a myth and only exists to oppress people.
Yeah.
But we must understand it in order to fight the oppressors.
Wow.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
But the sort of neutrality about it and the nebulous nature is a strength, or do you think it's a weakness? In your personal opinion.
I don't know.
Okay.
I'm tempted to say strength.
Yes.
Just because then, you are kind of not drawing a lot of biases and really loaded mental images and narratives and all the rest of it. I don't know if I'm making sense when I say that, but do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I understand. It's quite a hard question I asked you.
It is.
Yeah.
So let's get...
Do
you want your opinion?
Yes. I think it depends on how you feel about what story should be doing. Should they be telling an allegory of our times? Should they be saying something about race? Or
should they be doing anything?
Yeah. I think the book is trying to say something, because obviously it's about, an oppressor going to the desert and mining it for materials. That's kind of very on the nose an allegory. So it's like, should it have gone further, or should that just be a wink wink nudge nudge? I'm not necessarily sure.
I think from what Frank Herbert has said in interviews, he was definitely going for allegory.
Oh, absolutely.
To be honest, as opposed to J.R.R. Tolkien, I think he was like on it.
Yeah.
As opposed to who?
J.R.R. Tolkien.
George R.R. Martin.
No, J.R.R. Tolkien.
Oh God, because you said J.R.R. Martin before, and I was like,
Did I?
Yeah, you say
always
it all the
mix
time.
those up, yeah.
Yeah. So I was just really confused. I was like, are we going for Game of Thrones,
Well, I
Lord
mean,
of
he
the
probably
Rings?
chose that to mess with you. So
Yeah, probably.
Yeah. Anyway.
screw you, George.
But
Sorry,
I do think he did what he did purposely. I've got another opinion here. By
Not another one.
So this is from the article Dune's Not a White Saviour Narrative, but It's Complicated by Haris Durrani. It's quite a famous article. And in it he writes, if anything...
Do you want to do the quote?
Oh, yeah, sorry. Sorry.
It's alright.
So in it he writes, quote, if anything, a downfall of Herbert's moustache...
Do you want someone else to read this one?
Yeah, I do.
Like you're getting a bit fuzzy eyed.
Yeah, I do.
Oh, can I do it?
Yeah,
You
of
did
course.
the last one. Sorry.
Can I do it?
Okay, in it, he says, quote, if anything, a downfall of Herbert's pastiche, syncretic approach is that many societies and faiths that were particular to specific times and places have been universalized or assumed to be interchangeable or analogous. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Still, it's also more complicated than that. Any analogous or inspired story, science fiction or otherwise, is going to have to deal with the interchangeability analogy problem in some way. But it's worth pausing and mulling over this issue. End quote.
So I really like this quote because, as with most good answers, it says yes and it says no.
It's not black and white. It's quite
No.
nuanced, isn't it?
And I think you can always point at something and say, oh, it's failed in this way because it hasn't... it hasn't been specific enough with what it was trying to do. That lack of
Specificity.
exactly is also a strength, because then it means that people can apply their own struggles to it quite easily. So, you know, when we were watching it, it was hard not to think about the ongoing genocide in Palestine, for example.
Yeah.
You know?
It's very much that.
Which obviously, you know, Frank Herbert, it wasn't, you know, it was a wink in the universe at that point. Hadn't happened.
Yeah.
So, and he didn't know it was going to happen. But because it lacks that...
Specificity.
Because it lacks that...
Specificity.
It means that we can make that connection. I also just want to point out Bo's saying that for me because I can't say it. I do want to lead on to a question about this, though. Is that how much leeway do we give fantasy and sci-fi writers on separating our world from what they borrow and what politics they put into their own stories?
Depends what they borrow, and it depends where they take it from, and it depends how much, I would say. Because I think if you're doing what he's done, which is obviously borrowing a lot and using real Arabic words,
Yes.
it kind of has to be a theme. It has to be part of it.
Yeah.
It can't not be addressed.
True. Moving on from that, it does have to be addressed. However, I think in terms of this story, one of the things I found fascinating in researching this is that I did not know that this universe is not separate from our own.
Is it not?
No.
No.
It's sort of depicted as being so far in the future that, you know, it doesn't really have any connection to our time anymore. But the way that I found this is that how he deals with religion. So in the Dune universe, Frank Herbert is obviously very interested in the creation, the effects, and the commandeering of religious belief. In the appendices of Dune, Herbert relates a history spanning thousands of years of religious revolt and assimilation, which culminate in the creation of three powers. Seb, would you like to read what the three powers are for us?
Yes. So number 1, the mathematical Western power of the Spacing Guild / royal family / houses. Number 2, the belief in the Orange Catholic Bible, an amalgamation of all significant religious thought on earth, including Christian, Buddhist, and Islamic belief. And finally, the Bene Gesserit, which emerged after the Butlerian Jihad.
So, the reason we know that it still has like a tangible link to our universe is because the Orange Catholic Bible was basically a attempt by political parties to unite all religious thought into one book.
Right.
So the reason that there are real Arabic words used throughout is also because it shares this history.
Right, okay.
But there's also a lot of Buddhist belief woven through, and it's not just isolated to the Fremen, and I think that's really important to remember.
Yeah.
I think that's interesting because I feel like I don't know if they'd ever try to do that, just because I think it serves the powers that be to have people you can blame and others, you know what I mean? So just squishing all of the people into one religion.
It's not so much that they squish all of the people into
it's
one
more
religion.
complicated than that.
It's just that there's this central text that a lot of different sects arise from. Is how I would describe it. Would you agree, Seb?
Right, okay.
Yes.
And I don't quite understand what you mean by one person to blame.
I feel like we naturally split off into religious people, religious institutions. There are so many like different splits that happen between different people who believe different things. It's hard to imagine that they would all like find common ground ever. That's what I'm saying.
But if you think about it this way, the Jewish Bible is the source of the three major Abrahamic religions.
Right, yeah. So that's where everything, that's the Orange Catholic Bible.
Yeah, it's the source where everything else spreads out.
Right.
And further events happen which make people believe in different things. So Seb mentioned one of them, which is the Butlerian
Jihad.
Yeah. So describe that to me, Seb.
So yeah, it's basically sourced from the fact that in our Earth, I want to say it's pretty far in our future if we're going off our present. Machines and AI, they're banned. So any machine that thinks, it can't exist. It has to all come from people. So they almost go right back to this slightly, to them, primitive way of being. So people then had to develop this skill, which was, being basically computers in their mind. And I can't remember the character name. But there's a guy that you see in the first one. There's a couple of them, actually. One of them is part of the Sardaukar people, and then the other one is part of the Atreides house, and you see him at the beginning of the first Dune Part 1. He kind of blinks and his eyes go white, and he does all the mental calculations of how long it took the Emperor's vessel to get there, how much they spent doing it, and all the rest of it. And he's a mentat, so he can do those massive calculations in his head. And in the books, Paul Atreides is a mentat as well. He can also do that. He's trained to do that. So they're basically, incredibly fast calculations, just all in their mind.
So they're like human computers.
Human computers, yeah.
Yeah. And after this uprising, one of the sects that becomes prevalent is the Bene Gesserit.
Yes.
Which have similar... I'm going to say similar. We're not going to disagree again, Seb, because I would say they're magic. You would say they're not.
I didn't say they weren't. I just think it's a different kind of magic to the fantasy thing that we were talking about.
Agree to disagree. But they also develop skills, don't they? Because of this.
Yes.
And as we know, the Bene Gesserit are responsible for the Fremen belief in the coming of a Messiah. For the what's it called? The
Kwisatz Haderach.
No, the other one. Lazil Muab. That they
Lisan al-Gaib.
Lisan al-Gaib.
Yes.
In the Fremen.
Yeah. That's what they get the Fremen to believe in.
Yes, yeah.
The main use of the Bene Gesserit. No, not the main use. The main power is that they've been doing this eugenical breeding program. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. That's how they're trying to create the Kwisatz Haderach.
Kwisatz Haderach, yeah.
Thank you,
Kwisatz
Seb.
Haderach, however you say it.
And I want to talk about, there's an article called Maybe Dune, a story about a white Superman created by a eugenics program is not the film we need right now, by Paul B. Sturtevant, I want to say. Sturtevant. And he says, science fiction though it may be, the science this narrative it is based on is not just bunk, but deeply destructive. It doesn't matter whether the Bene Gesserit are shown to be evil. The very idea that they could be successful is itself an evil one. No amount of selective breeding could bring about the Superman that either the Gesserit or the Nazis are after. And more, the strength of humanity is in its collective diversity, not its purity. The very idea that a selective breeding program like this could even theoretically work, might even have the chance to bring about a superhero, might as well be an ad for the alt-right.
End quote.
End quote. What do you think of this statement?
I think that's kind of the whole point of Dune.
Okay.
Not in the films. I think that's missed completely, at least in the first one. It's touched on. I don't think you're meant to sympathise with the Bene Gesserit. They're very cold and detached, and that's a whole other thing. But I think that's the point of the books, very much so, and it does ultimately fail and cause way more deaths than people it could ever save.
So I think the whole point of this breeding program is to say, yeah, what if you did that? And as you said, the results aren't positive.
They're not at all. They ultimately lead to a giant worm emperor. And then, do you know what? That's not even the worst thing. His era is actually low-key one of peace.
That's disturbing.
It's just he has 10,000 years of no war.
Because give things over to the worms and see.
He saw what his dad did, and he was like, "Nah, I'm not doing that."
Is there a lack of free will involved in that though?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
That's it comes about that people need war. You want conflict. This isn't working, and you're unhappy because there's no conflict. It's like this whole thing. Anyway, that's a whole other.
So it becomes then a question of, would you rather have peace and no free will, or free will and war? That's an I can see that being like the road you want to take.
It's good.
Yeah,
it's good. It works, but that's not touched on in the films. At least not yet.
Not yet.
But it's not really.
I hope we get a worm emperor.
I want Leto II, the worm emperor. I want that on my screen by June 2026. That's what I want.
Do you know what's disturbing?
And I want to play him. Sorry, go on.
Do you know what's disturbing?
Go
People
on.
will thirst over that worm.
Yeah.
Will they?
Oh, are you kidding
Are
me?
you
Have you seen
joking?
the internet? Will
There
people
will
thirst over
be
the worm?
adult videos
That's the worst.
of
Adult
Leto
videos
the
of the
Second.
There's a big following for the xenomorph from Aliens. People love that guy.
Oh, that doesn't surprise me.
There's worse than that, but we're not yet.
That's a podcast episode
Yeah.
for another day. Okay, well that's great.
That's correct.
That's great.
I hope we get Worm Emperor. On the account of the Bene Gesserit, not on the account, on the subject of the Bene Gesserit, there's a quote by Ursula Le Guin. I know we've had a lot of quotes.
Ursula Le Guin. She's back. She needs her own jingle.
Yeah.
Yeah, we need to give her her own section because we can't go an episode without mentioning her.
Well,
She's
she always has so many good things to say.
She's the queen. She knows what to say.
But I am going to get this quote in full because I think it's my favourite quote from Ursula Le Guin and I think about it at least once every 2 days.
Is that your Roman Empire?
It's my Roman Empire.
Ursula Le Guin is your Roman Empire.
Yeah, a lot of things Ursula Le Guin related, but specifically this quote.
Okay.
So, Bo, I'm going to get you to read it if you don't
Okay.
mind.
Quote, "But I didn't and still don't like making a cult of women's knowledge, preening ourselves on knowing things men don't. Women's deep irrational wisdom, women's instinctive knowledge of nature, and so on. All that all too often merely reinforces the masculinist idea of women as primitive and inferior, women's knowledge as elementary, primitive, always down below at the dark roots, while men get to cultivate and own the flowers and crops that come into the light. But why should women keep talking baby talk while men get to grow up? Why should women feel blindly while men get to think?" End quote.
So I love this because I think once you know this, you start seeing it everywhere.
Yeah. Oh, I was thinking that. It's so true.
And I think Dune, for all the good that we have with its feminist sort of ideals, because, you know, there's not a lot of sci-fi from this period where you'd have an all-female powerful sect, you know? But the other thing is that sect, their power is largely revolves around procreation. And again, Seb, you're going to argue with me about the magic thing.
I don't care anymore. Say what you want to say.
But to me, especially, and I will give you this, but in the language of the film, the way that they depict the Bene Gesserit, like they're in caves, you know, there's women chanting, it's quite animalistic, do you know what I mean? That sums it up for me.
I mean, they're very witchy.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. And they are very much so that. I think if you're talking arcane magic in Dune, that's as much as it gets.
Yeah.
Like, and it's interesting, and they really are kind of mystified and made into these kind of female empowered, you know, forces of nature.
Yeah.
And it's so obvious as well. Like, I mean, the Reverend Mother in the first one she says, what a waste to use all that power on a boy. And they can control what gender their babies are as well.
Yeah.
And they always choose to have girls so that they carry on the Bene Gesserit line. So Paul Atreides being born is a direct, you know, insult to the orders.
And do you think that has some connection, Bo, with... Because there is a sort of... I don't want to offend anyone when I say this, but there is a culty feeling about Mary, mother of Jesus, isn't there?
Well, there's cults about her.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I didn't know whether I was just pulling that out of thin air.
No, it's, yeah.
It's very much that.
There are many cults. I mean, she's often, like, used as well. She's often worshipped in, like, witchcraft circles as, like, her own deity as well.
Oh,
like,
okay.
separately from Christianity. She's got a lot of power behind her of her own accord, I think.
Okay.
Sorry, what was the question?
Just that I think this is tapping into that a little bit.
Yeah,
it
yeah,
absolutely
definitely. And the
is.
power there is procreation. You know, she
Yeah.
gave birth to Jesus. That's essentially what's happening here.
Yeah. It is sad, though. I remember thinking when I'm watching the second film that she just loses all of her personality to this power, like when she drinks
Oh,
that.
Jessica.
Oh, who, Jessica?
Jessica,
Do you
yeah.
think so?
I think she starts and she's very like, oh, I'm quite scared to drink the potion, and then she drinks it and she kind of just becomes this kind of really scheming, like, I guess, I don't know, I think maybe it's the way that the film portrayed her, but from then on she was kind of scheming in a very Morgana in the shadows sort of way. Yeah, and it always makes me sad when, like, in films women are kind of just used as, like, the breeding, like, it's because she's, like, making a baby of her own, and that kind of becomes the focus,
and that adds to her sacredness.
Yeah, and that kind of
But then there's also the abomination that she carries, which is the Alea, Paul Atreides' future sister, who is almost the direct opposite of him. He's the other side. She's the other side of the coin. She's demonic. She's an abomination. She shouldn't exist.
Oh, she's the Antichrist.
She's the Antichrist, essentially. Just not really, but you know the way that they view her. It's the ultimate taboo. What she's done,
right?
Which is drink the sacred water while she was pregnant, which makes the child then immediately have all the knowledge of her previous ancestors, which is ridiculous. It's insane. But that's what happens. And
I can't remember whether in the book she knows. Do you remember?
Who knows what?
Jessica knows that she can't drink the drink.
She knows,
What?
yes.
Right, yeah.
But she does it anyway.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
But she also doesn't kind of have a choice.
And she also doesn't really believe it at first. Remember when she was like, what is this that you're giving me? I don't think she fully believes in the power of that or that it will do anything to her. She's from the Bene Gesserit. She's not from Arrakis. The Reverend Mother on Arrakis has always been there, and you know, presumably for a very, very, very long time, and so that they know that that's what it'll do. But she's quite skeptical. She's like, reason. She's always having that chant of "Don't let the fear take over." I can't remember the exact words she says, but she's very, very, very rational.
Fear is the tiny death.
Yeah,
something like that.
Something like that. Fear is the mind killer. You know, she's so controlled that the idea of something like that taking it and controlling her is, you know, it's beyond thought. It's not how she was trained to be.
Well, in that sense, then, you could almost read it as religion takes a very reasonable and practical woman and turns her into a superstitious, ghoulish figure almost.
Yeah, because then she's like, there's still people who don't believe. We need to change the non-believers. And it's really sinister, and I don't think it's glorified.
No.
Oh, and that's quite tragic.
Yeah, it's
It
really
is because
sad.
Paul also, I felt his loss then, that he lost his mother. Like, he kind of lost her at that point.
Perfect. Thank you, Bo, because that
all
brings us on to section 4.
Oh, I so meant to do that.
Our
Yes.
final section, because we're going to talk about Paul Atreides.
My guy. Just kidding. Not my guy.
Because I want to ask you, and because I see this as a common criticism of Dune, and a lot of people use this to justify saying that it is a white saviour narrative, is that Paul is very much made a sympathetic character. And you are very much supposed to connect to Paul and relate to Paul, I feel, both in the book and the film. So do you think that centering Paul makes the work, no matter what it does in terms of defying its genre and defying those trappings of the white saviour narrative, do you think by centering him that it inherently wipes that out and it does become a white saviour narrative?
No.
Okay.
I don't. And I think a lot of it is saying that he not that he didn't have a choice, he could have had a choice, but these systems and the way that his surrounding world is and has been set up was built that way 10,000 years ago. And it's been leading to this for so long that it was going to happen without him or not. It would have happened some other way. So it's him. And the reason we see it being him is because this is when it happens. But I think whoever it was, it would have been the same. There's no escaping it. It's the system. It's not just him. It's all in favour of this holy war happening.
What do you think?
I kind of disagree.
Okay.
Yeah.
You're allowed to have the wrong opinion.
I think I kind of really resonate with that. Like, I think Paul being the protagonist, it would have been so much more subversive if it had come from Stilgar's perspective or Zendaya Chani's perspective, or like, I think when you do center a white male protagonist who is the white savior in the story, if you're purely going for allegory and you're not going for kind of character, I think it probably would have been more subversive if they'd gone for that angle. Because, like, even when you're watching the film, it's like the way that the narrative moves, the way no one really gets as much screen time as him. Like, you're not positioned. It still does every beat of a white saviour story.
Before you argue, Seb, I'll let you rip in a minute, but I just want to provide a little bit of evidence for what Bo said there, but only in terms of the film. I can't speak to the books, but I think with the film, and this was always going to be a problem, but as much as it's a sci-fi and a political drama, it's also an action film, and we're supposed to revel a little bit in what
completely.
Timothée Chalamet does as Paul Atreides.
Yeah.
You know, every time he has a victory, we're supposed to go, oh, yeah, go, yeah. Whatever chant they have, like, we all die or whatever. That's not it.
Yeah.
And I think because he has all of these small victories that we're able to revel in, then when he has his last victory at the end where they all go off to jihad, and I definitely felt this, is that we were supposed to feel like, I don't think elation is the right word, but we're still supposed to be on Paul's side at that time, I think.
So there's a couple of things I want to pick up on what you said.
My mind's got points.
So the first thing you said, if it was from Stilgar's perspective or one of the others, or Chani's perspective, it would be subversive. Yes, but would it be successful? Second of all, you said if it was meant as purely an allegory, then yeah, it's white saviour, whatever. I don't think it is meant as purely an allegory. Yeah. Otherwise, certain characters wouldn't make certain decisions, and there wouldn't be.
Yeah, I see.
Thirdly, of all, I think it's interesting to have it from his perspective because yes, you root for him. You're going through all this, and then oh no, he's committing genocide. I was wrong for rooting for him. Is that not in itself a criticism of the idea of the Messiah and the white saviour? You know what I mean? Yeah. I do think, you know, with the films where we're at, I can totally see where you're coming from. If it's stopped there, it's not really successful in kind of destabilizing that mindset and that idea and that Western ideal we have. However, if you were to go further with it and go where the books go, I think having it from his perspective is so much more devastating because it's like, it was always going to end up this way, whether it was him, whether it was the next iteration of, you know, Bene Gesserit offspring, whoever it was.
Yeah. Okay, couple of pieces of evidence on Seb's side. Because I definitely see that. So there's two things here. I think in terms of us identifying with Timothy, I think Seb's right in that later on, if they did do Dune Messiah, for example, it's quite powerful that we're led to identify with Paul, and then when he realises he's the bad guy, it's like, wait, are we the bad guys?
Yeah. Am I the drama? Yes, babes, you're the drama.
And I do think that's quite powerful. The other thing I think the film tried to do is they centred Chani quite a lot compared to the book.
Yes.
Definitely. Yeah, she was a lot stronger.
And I think it was a really clever move to make her the opposition to Paul being the Messiah and saying, no, we deserve a Fremen Messiah. We deserve one of our own to lead us. And I think that's quite powerful.
Yeah, and characterising the Fremen identity as well and having them be like, who is this guy? What the hell?
True.
And, you know, and just having that nuance of like, they're not just a collective agreeing whole. They're not a hive mind. They're individuals within that. And,
yes.
And they can see the issues with it.
And the other thing is that Seb mentioned that it's about systems as opposed to individuals.
Yeah.
And Frank Herbert actually did confirm that. He said he was a lot more interested in systems of oppression as opposed to individuals. And the whole point of Paul as a character is for him to realise he is not important.
Yeah. I mean, that's how it ends up being. Spoilers to anyone, like, stop if you don't want to hear what happens to him. But he literally ends up being a wandering blind man in the desert. And he's nothing. He's no one. His name lives on, but his identity, who he is lost, and he regrets it immensely, or it's implied anyway. And it's kind of like, oh, yeah, you're not really a hero, are you? It's kind of like the Achilles in the underworld.
True.
kind of thing.
True. I should explain for anyone who hasn't read the Odyssey.
Which might be a lot of people.
In the Odyssey, when Odysseus goes down to the underworld, he meets Achilles, who was, the greatest warrior of his time. And Odysseus asks him if he regrets it or something like that.
Yeah. If you could have stayed and lived a life where you weren't famous and weren't revered, would you? Or something like that.
And he talks about how if he could go back in time, he'd just be an anonymous farmer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And have lived out, probably, in love with Patroclus forever.
I think Paul Atreides would have done that as well. I think if he'd had the choice, he would have just not done any of it.
Yeah.
Did you have an argument, though? Because we did.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, why... I was just going to ask why you think it wouldn't be successful if it was told from, one of those other characters' point of view.
I think, personally, because they represent a very biased standpoint, which is, well, in the case of Stilgar, here's my Messiah, here he is, and then, oh my god, I can't even remember what happens in the second one with him, in the second book, not the second film.
Yeah.
But it's quite, you don't see much more than that. With Chani in the books anyway, it's, again, she is kind of the concubine of Paul. She sees that one kind of way of being, and whereas Paul, he migrates through the cultures. He's seen one side of it. He knows the bigger political game, and he can see into the future as well.
I also think the obvious needs to be pointed out, because when was Dune released? The 60s?
Something like that. Let me have a look, actually.
The 50s or 60s. How many people would have picked it up if it was a person of colour as
so true.
the narrator, as opposed to it being Paul?
1965.
Yeah, and we know that Ursula Le Guin, obviously ahead of her time, all praise Ursula Le Guin, but the Wizard of Earthsea, why did you
lose it then?
In the Wizard of Earthsea, Ged, the main character, is not white, but she had to hide that for 3/4 of the book in order for people to pick it up.
Yeah.
And even then, some readers didn't realise reading it. There's so much art of him being a white man because of that.
Yeah, it's true.
So, I think there's practical reasons why it had to be a white person as opposed to someone else.
I wonder if, what it would have done to the film if they'd have chosen not to cast someone white.
I don't know. Yeah. I guess we'll never know.
I guess we'll never know.
And one last ending note, because I think this is really fun. You go back far enough into the history, the Fremen aren't actually native to Dune.
Yeah. Well, they're all human.
Yeah. But specifically, they haven't been there that long in terms of the history. They were banished. Their ancestors were banished there.
Yeah. Well, it makes sense. It is a
like
pretty...
Australia.
Is Dune just Australia of space?
They should have all been talking like this. Lisan al-Qaib. Yeah.
It's like the different apocalypse. There's the Hunger Games apocalypse in America and then the Dune apocalypse in Australia.
God, do you know what? The apocalypse in Britain would be so depressing.
Yeah, that would be rubbish.
Do you know what I think?
Yeah,
I think because I think most British people would just roll over and die.
Yeah,
100%. Right, where does that leave us?
That's it.
That's everything.
That's it.
Well,
we did it.
Got to the end.
We did that.
That was the first episode on Dune. Because we're also going to talk about the ecology of Dune.
Woo!
Which I actually think is the more interesting subject.
Yeah.
When it comes to Dune.
It's so cool.
Yeah. So, but it's been fun. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for bearing with us over the dog noises.
Yes. For context, guys, all 6 of you who listen.
If that. I think that's optimistic.
but my dog Merlin has been an absolute nightmare. You will hear snippets of him over this episode, but it has been non-stop.
Yeah, he's been...
He's a talkative dog at the best of times.
He had a lot of opinions on Dune.
He did. He had a lot to contribute, but unfortunately we can't understand it, so he's been silenced.
And on that ominous note...
Just like the Fremen.
Tune in next time for the next episode of the Quantum Egg Podcast.
The Quantum Egg podcast is a project from Quantum Egg Theatre Company, a theatre company based in Manchester. Trans and neurodivergent led, we make radical, queer, groundbreaking theatre in tandem with talented emerging artists in our community. To find out more about our mission, visit the link in the description. Quantum Egg is a volunteer-run company. If you liked what you heard today and believe in our mission, you can donate the price of a cup of coffee by visiting our coffee page. That's ko-fi. Link also in the description. You can also help us out by giving us a 5-star review and telling us what you thought of today's episode. The Quantum Egg podcast is hosted by Charlie Rigg, featuring Bo Warner and Sebastian Emerson. Edited by Bo Warner, sound designed by Anastasia Zhikova.